This is the Content Strategy Insights podcast, episode number 141. When you first imagine systems thinking, you might picture Donella Meadows' stocks and flows diagrams, or technical practices like causal loop diagramming. Sheryl Cababa thinks that designers benefit from a different look at systems thinking, an approach that cultivates a holistic mindset rather than any specific methods or practices. Sheryl wrote her new book, Closing the Loop, specifically to help designers benefit from this powerful kind of thinking.
Welcome to the Content Strategy Insights podcast, where accomplished content strategy experts share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. Our mission is to democratize content strategy, to make its principles and practices accessible to everyone. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 141 of the Content Strategy Insights podcast. I am really excited today to welcome to the show Sheryl Cababa. Sheryl is the Chief Strategy Officer at Substantial, and a really prominent agency in Seattle. Well, welcome to the show, Sheryl. Tell the folks a little bit more about what you're doing these days at Substantial.
Yeah, for sure. So we are a basically design and software development consultancy. And so we do research and strategy, as well as software design and build. So kind of end-to-end services. And a lot of our work is focused in education. And so that's where I spend a lot of my time and energy and attention is working with ed tech organizations as well as philanthropic organizations who fund ed tech and other educational products and services. And is really nice because we get to use design strategy as a method to help, define and direct investments in the space. And so, it's really, I think it connects quite a bit to what I talk about in my book.
Right. Well, and I got it. There are two quick things about that. One is like you also in your education includes, you teach in the HCD programs at the University of Washington, correct?
I do. Yeah. So I'm an educator myself.
Yeah. So you have more than one role in the education world. But the main reason I wanted to have you on the show today is you just wrote this really amazing book called Closing the Loop: Systems Thinking for Designers. I just love it because it gives designers access to this thing we all have heard about and think we know a lot about, but you present the information in a way that I think is just really uniquely helpful. Can you tell folks a little bit more about, just kind of your top level view of the book? Like we're at a cocktail party and you just want to get the first overview of the book out there. How would you describe it?
Okay, so there's this practice called systems thinking. I think it's been around for decades now. It's often used in combination with things like organizational change management, as well as, I guess, systems design in engineering and other fields like that. I think one of the things that made me interested in systems thinking is that I was kind of feeling like there were some gaps in my formal practices as a designer, which are really centered around design thinking and its methods and approach. And I thought that within my practice that I could benefit from systems thinking and some of the tools and methods therein, as well as the mindset, and try to integrate that into my practice. And one of the things that I would like to emphasize about this particular book is that it's not a book that's aimed at people who are already doing systems thinking and as analysts or in like a formal practice. It's really aimed at design practitioners who are really versed in design approaches like design thinking, human-centered design, as well as user experience design. And the idea is that you can sort of shift your mindset towards using a systems lens while still sort of integrating this kind of humanistic approach that is embodied within design thinking. And I hadn't seen any sort of text that had done that up until this point. I mean, I think there's quite a few organizations in the design world that are focused on integrating systems thinking. I think there's sort of like a network of those who think of themselves as systemic designers. And I just wanted to maybe kind of bring to the table how I approach integrating systems thinking in my own practice. And also from a practical standpoint, just kind of thinking about like, what do we have time for? Like, what can we actually do without it kind of taking over and replacing like all of our other tools and methods that we use as designers?
Yeah, as you said that, I'm thinking like, yeah, we all have all this spare time to just learn whole new practices like this. And it's
Right.
really not about, and one of the things I love about your approach is that it's not so much about learning a new practice as it is about cultivating a new mindset. Is that an accurate way to portray it?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. One of the things I was saying to another practitioner the other day is like, I sort of feel like once you kind of engage in a systems thinking mindset, you kind of see systems everywhere. So I have these kind of sidebars in my book called system spotting, and they're really oriented around like kind of like gleaning information from the things that are around you. So kind of understanding like, why does one neighborhood in the city have like lots of trees and another neighborhood doesn't? What story is that telling you about the underlying system? What is that telling you about how things are interconnected? Also, causality. So I can talk about like sort of the three sort of key principles or concepts, which is there's interconnectedness, there's causality, and there's wholeness. And so you can look at examples like that and kind of think about those things from those lenses, like how everything is interconnected, whether it's kind of like sociocultural, like understanding or tendencies, combined with like political outputs like policy. And then there's causality. So how one thing leads to another and has certain radiating effects. And then lastly, there's wholeness, like what is just beyond your purview, that you have not acknowledged, or could expand your thinking in terms of how decisions are made, or like the effects that kind of decisions beyond your purview are having on the world. And so I think just adopting that mindset maybe helps designers to expand their thinking around like, how do we problem solve? You might actually expand who you think about as your end users or end beneficiaries just by doing some of these exercises, for example. And I think that's a really good starting point for anyone looking to engage in systems thinking.
Yeah, the way you just said that. I mean, I love that you started with this story about why there are more trees in one neighborhood than another, and then immediately went in because you were going to tell a story that showed how you've embodied and adopted this notion of interconnectedness, causality, and wholeness, and you just see it everywhere. But then you had the presence of mind to back out and explain that to us. I love
Right.
that. That was like you modeled everything that we need right there. But what's interesting about that to me, and the way you said that this is like kind of, I think you said something about a starting point, is that I almost feel like this is like the pond in the pool, and it ripples out, and that's kind of like these are ways to identify the ripples. It seems like that how because so much like product design or UX design is sort of like feels like there's limits to it, and this just kind of shows I guess that gets mainly to the interconnectedness point, but it seems like it's relevant to the causality and wholeness points as well.
Yeah, I think that's kind of one of there's a friction, right? When you're, for example, if you are a digital designer, you're like working on a digital product, kind of like you're shaping the design of like a screen-based thing, and you're kind of working on like, where do the buttons go? How is this thing structured, or what have you? It might feel like incredibly limited. And so a question that I get a lot of the time is, okay, how do I mean, I can expand my thinking, but I don't have any control. Like I'm not part of the decision making about things like our business model or what have you. And um like I understand that tension. I feel like there's a couple of answers to that. One is, well, it's easy to say, but you should be part of those conversations. Like if you care about this and you're executing on
Yeah.
something and you don't agree with the more systemic decisions that have been made about what it is you're designing, then you should be part of those conversations. If you're not part of those conversations, I do think like there are still ways of sort of integrating systems thinking into the way that you execute in your work. And it might be just thinking more broadly about who your user base is, right?
Mhm.
It could be just kind of thinking about, again, kind of those things that are just beyond your purview that might manifest as a feature or something in your work. So, like recently, my team was working on courseware for higher ed, like this digital courseware. And oftentimes, like you're thinking about just like walking through the course and how it sort of unfolds in front of you as a student, and knowing, like we live in the space of like user advocacy. So you're kind of thinking about how the student might experience this. But kind of engaging in systems thinking up front from kind of determining what that UI looks like, you can maybe even design and integrate features that might have more of like that might affect outcomes more widely. So there could be things that don't have anything to do with how the course progresses. It could have to do with how people communicate with each other on the platform, or how the platform is one way to communicate of many. So like could students get in touch with their advisor on this platform, for example? Maybe that's not the best idea, but maybe it is actually a really good idea. It just kind of depends on the context. So it is about as well, like kind of expanding the context in which your work sits, and kind of thinking just in general, kind of learning how to think more broadly about what it is you're doing and what it is you're trying to create.
Yeah, and that example you just gave, it really illustrates, I think, what you're getting at, that even if it's not in your control, or technically in your purview, that as long as you're thinking this way, you can do stuff that other stakeholders or customers or whoever might recognize as like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. And that's just because it's not like you're getting out of your lane. You're just expanding your approach to the design issue at hand. Is that, and so I'm starting to see like, it was in before we started talking, I was like, I kind of got conceptually when you talk in the book about how you sort of not contrast, but sort of like show how systems thinking and design thinking are kind of like different beasts, but and you can kind of apply the systems thinking to your design process. Anyhow, I think that was a great example of that. Can you talk a little bit more about like how the like how you cultivate it, because you've already exhibited like 3 or 4 times just in this short conversation that you've completely embodied and internalized this new mindset. Can you help other people along just a little bit in that journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think part I feel very lucky to be based foundationally a design researcher, because I think that automatically has kind of given me the ability to kind of shape um kind of things like what the objectives of my research are. And so I don't think I'm trying to kind of think about like how do you have people kind of expand their lens if they're not in that mindset. And um it's interesting because I think people in our field, they're kind of craving this because they're working on things that the tools that we have for working on those solutions or products or what have you are kind of designed to think about an individual using like in the moment of using a product, right? Like that's usually how we're designing things and trying to make products better. And it feels like there's some tension between that and what we feel like is like some of the broader issues, like what happens at scale with what I'm designing. Like let's say you're working on the social media platform. There's going to be some radiating effects of like whatever it is you're doing as you're designing for an individual using things in the moment. An example I like is like if you think about infinite scroll. So infinite scroll, is like when you're scrolling through Instagram and it's giving you just enough variety to keep scrolling forever. So it's just called infinite. And Asa Raskin, who actually it was like kind of in charge of like designing that feature, has basically said, I don't think this feature is actually good for humanity. Like, in hindsight, because of kind of those radiating effects that it has. And I think like we all seem to have a desire to kind of be able to anticipate that sort of thing or think about that in the moment as we're kind of designing something and trying to better understand what will happen. So I think that's just like, maybe that's a motivating factor, is like, you're not just like going more broad for the sake of going more broad. You're trying to be more thoughtful about like, what are the outcomes that we want, maybe even like as a society, like from the work that I'm doing. And I think it's a way for designers to potentially have like more impact. And there's different like levels at which you can use systems thinking. So one of the things that I describe is just like, I feel like my work, for example, has really flipped from like a designer who is like in the weeds of designing something. Like, I was a product designer for probably almost 15 years. Like, it sounds like a really long time thinking about it now. And I was like in the space of like basically designing screeny things for like a lot of my career. And now I think of myself as like using design and design methods as a facilitator, like basically helping to facilitate other people's knowledge and expertise. So what that means is kind of like using these strategic lenses to help those who are kind of in the position of decision making to be better informed, to be better aligned, and ensuring that the people in the room are multidisciplinary stakeholders who are involved in decision making at various points in the system. So I think basically just expanding who your stakeholders are in terms of your decision making process is like one step you can take, whether that's like your end users or beneficiaries, or the people who are actually within your organization or outside of it who could have an impact on some of like what you're deciding to do.
That sounds like a really interesting, like maybe like a little gateway drug into this or something like that. That notion of just talk to two stakeholders that you wouldn't have otherwise in this
Right.
project, and then start. That's one way you could begin to cultivate this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one
Yeah.
of the things that I like doing for any of my project work is finding academic experts who like work in that particular field, or have a certain lens on whatever it is we're doing. Like, so in education, there's lots of people, right, like that we can talk to who are like maybe working at the intersection of like equity and math education, for example, and even more specifically, maybe in K-12. And I think just like kind of reaching out, like I've yet to meet a researcher who doesn't want to talk about their research, and like finding out from them. I think a lot of them have like kind of a systems lens on what's going on that you can't achieve just by talking to like end users, right? Like just by talking to like teachers in the system or talking to students. They can kind of understand like what's going on at the intersection of like policy and educational institutions, for example. And that'll give you kind of like a lens on whatever it is you're working on that could result in like very different ideas of what innovation might look like, or very different ideas of like what problem solving looks like in that space.
Yeah, the way you just said that, the academics, any one of them, can do the off the top of their head the review of the literature in their field and just know like infinitely more than you could. And there's other kinds of researchers you could approach as well. I want to back up just a little bit. The start of this little part here, you were talking about the infinite scroll and the unintended, and that reminded me of the chapter, I think it's chapter 8 in the book, of unintended consequences. And it seems like, again, back to the kind of ripple idea earlier, and that idea that like what you just said about the research, that's like a beneficial unintended consequence, but the infinite scroll seems like oh my God, what have we done? We can never end the internet now. How do you approach that? Like, how do you put on your new systems thinking hat and anticipate good and bad consequences like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, I often tell the story of somebody coming up to me after one of my talks where it was like talking about like designing for outcomes and saying to me, like, well, we can't anticipate everything though. So, like, what do we do? And I'm just like, it's kind of a weird way to frame it, because if you can't anticipate everything, does that mean you don't want to anticipate anything? Like, like, we should want to better understand like what could happen. One thing I didn't write about in the book, which I find really fascinating, are like war games and sort of exercises like that, where like you have multidisciplinary stakeholders kind of playing out a scenario. So I remember hearing about how a bunch of different people were kind of playing out a scenario about the 2020 election. And, there were several people involved in that who were like, well, the president isn't going to accept the election results. And I remember there was a lot of like, before that election, there was a lot of sort of denial in the air. Like, that won't happen. That has never happened. How can that be? How can that be? And like people who were saying like, I think that's going to happen, were kind of viewed as almost like, oh my gosh, don't like pull us into the hysteria, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's exactly what ended up happening. And I think those who are kind of doing a lot of those modeling exercises that are like, the equivalent of war games, had actually surfaced those kind of worst case scenarios. And so I do think like, and maybe that's a case of like, okay, there's a distinction between doing that kind of analysis and being like, okay, these are the things that could happen, and actually doing something about it. Like maybe that was a scale on which like it was hard to do things about it. But I do think like in your frame of decision making, you're like an individual designer in this field or what have you, or design strategist or something, and you're trying to kind of like figure out how things might shake out. I have a tool in there, for example, called the futures wheel, which, I use kind of like a lot in my design practice, that just kind of helps you play out like how things might happen. And it might be based on like some assumptions or what have you, but I do think like it might surface some lines of thought that you might not have had before. And this can be used for everything from like, should our company, I think the example I use in the book is like, what happens if we have everybody come back to the office, right? Like it could be just like a very like, what feels like a small example like that, but then you realize as you're going through this exercise, there's all sorts of like weird radiating effects. Or like, what if our company just went fully remote? And I think a lot of us in the working world have had experiences with either of those
Exactly.
at this point, and can probably rattle off the radiating effects for either of those decisions. And I think these are just kind of like tools that activate that mindset, right? Of like thinking more broadly than just like a linear way that things might happen or play out, or stopping your thinking at your output. Like, basically, this is the decision we're going to make. I guess we'll see how things shake out, which isn't always a bad thing. But I think just kind of like being able to respond to what might happen helps helps make all of us kind of like better equipped.
Yeah, you're reminding me. I had a guest on, God, a few years ago, Eric Best, who used to be a scenario planner at Morgan Stanley,
Mm.
and that's what they do. Is they
Yeah.
get in a room and imagine things like, hey, imagine an American election that just went completely sideways, and then and he cited an example of like a banker who saved his bank like $2 billion by not making some dumb decision because they identified it in that scenario. So I guess one of the points of this, instilling this systems thinking mindset, is that you're not doing like full blown like scenario planning, but you have a better chance of anticipating like you said, you want to be outcomes focused, but you also want to be kind of like outcome influencing aware. Is that I don't know, I'm trying to think through how that the dynamics of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the book is kind of divided into two parts. One is like understanding the status quo. So in order to make decisions about like where you can make change, you need to understand what's going on in whatever the problem space is today, and like kind of like more thoroughly analyzing that than we probably do in a lot of cases. And then the second part of the book is envisioning the future. And so there's both some practical ways of doing that and very like provocation oriented ways of doing that. And I think the practical ways are creating things like a theory of change. You know, we see this quite often in yeah, sort of like policy spaces like global health and what have you. But I think it's actually a really nice tool for designers to use because it's meant to consider not just what you plan to happen, like when people are like using whatever it is like you're designing, but also like what should the outcomes and impact be beyond that? Like what are you kind of seeking like far beyond whatever it is you're designing? And then you then kind of go into the space of like, okay, then now what are the potential unintended consequences of this? Um, and so what's nice about kind of like creating a theory of change is like you can kind of identify areas that might not actually fall into the design space. Like you might be dependent on like if you're doing civic design or what have you, you might be dependent on like certain policy decisions in order for there to be success, right? Like if you're kind of like thinking about, okay, how can we communicate and educate people about getting the latest vaccine booster? One thing that can grease the wheels on that is like, what are the policy decisions in that municipality or state, right? Like, what are the things that can kind of like help this be successful? I think there was a recent example of that very thing in Seattle of like the Seattle school district kind of did some very specific outreach things about getting like one of the vaccine boosters, and the vaccination rate was like 80% or something in those specific communities, and it had to do with basically like using like the school as like a point of communication. And I think it's really hard to like come up with ways of like holistically problem solving without really understanding first about like what are all the different points of intervention. um because like yeah, you could set up a vaccine stand on some street and like that won't that maybe that doesn't have a dent in like vaccination rates because it's just like not combined with like anything else that might make that successful. So it
Yeah,
is really
that's
deep problem solving in the context of other problem solving.
right. Because you're reminding me now of like, I think a lot of designers and content people come up against like government stuff in terms of like regulation and compliance and things like that. But you're talking about this is like more like not policy and analysis, but like understanding like this, the how you can leverage things that are going on in that bigger system to accomplish a goal that like you might just be designing an app to like help people sign up to get a booster,
Yeah.
but it's like, but it becomes something much bigger because of that insight. I like, yeah. Hey, Cheryl, I can't believe it. There's like 1,000 other things I want to ask you about, but we're coming up close to time, and I like to keep these around a half hour. I just want to make sure, though, before we wrap up, is there anything anything that we haven't got to yet that you want to make sure we cover, or that's just on your mind about integrating systems thinking in a design practice?
I don't think so. I mean, I do think like there is an aspect about systems thinking that people find really intimidating, which is like they usually associate it with causal loop diagramming, which can be these kind of dynamic maps that people create that kind of map forces, and then you plug in an intervention or something and then see how the map might change. I don't do any of that. Like I do sometimes create causal loop diagrams, but not always. And I just want to reinforce like there are many other tools in systems thinking. And then also if you are using causal loop diagrams, it can literally be two causal loops that are kind of telling the story about root cause. I think the point of using these tools is as a means of both analysis and alignment with your stakeholders. They're not meant to be like an end in and of itself. They're meant to kind of lead to how you make decisions in order to kind of solve the problems that you're identifying. So I just wanted to kind of like reinforce that because it comes up quite often, actually.
Yeah, no, and you're reminding me of like why I keep these to a half hour, because I could nerd out on tools and techniques, all that stuff, because like you have that whole, and I'll just kind of plug some of the stuff in the book. You talk about like the hard, and I think that's where the causal loop stuff comes in, that hard systems analysis versus a softer approach that's been that you talk about, and also Karl Popper's is this a clock thing or a cloud thing?
Right.
So I'll just kind of hint at some of the benefits of the book, that there's other explorations of that concept you just mentioned.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Cheryl. I really appreciate this conversation, and I really do wish we could continue. But I just hope folks get a chance to read the book and benefit from, because I really do feel like this is a truly unique advance in our profession, and I'm excited to see more systems thinking take hold here.
Yeah, I agree. I would love to see more of that in the field.
Well, fingers crossed. Thanks so much, Cheryl.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was a fun conversation.
Thank you for listening. If you can think of a friend who might enjoy this episode, please share it with them. And please join us again for our next content strategy interview.